There was a time when Richard Gere was a byword for easy charm, the type of man who caused the entire screen to halt without saying much. He moved between mirrors like a lost reflection in American Gigolo. He gave the world the impression that love and kindness could overcome all prejudice in Pretty Woman. Once upon a time, Richard Gere was the romantic, serene, and contemplative face of a whole generation. Then he disappeared. Hollywood, the place that had catapulted Richard Gere to the top, became silent as if he had never lived. He was no longer visible in box office blockbusters. His name was not among the Oscar finalists, and he had no significant part in the dominance of the cinematic universe. Many others said he was past his best, too elderly, too challenging, or just out of step with contemporary tastes. However, it is only the beginning. Other tales, an unyielding political position, an apparently innocuous kiss that resulted in 15 years of turmoil, and an artist who opted to stand up for what's right, even if it meant stepping away from the spotlight, are all hidden beneath it. What actually took place? Why was an icon removed from the main stage? Nobody has a clear response. All we know is that Richard Gere's name is no longer uttered in the places that previously honored him because of certain things he did and did not do. Perhaps it was a decision. It may have been a penalty. The tale was, and still is, everything from straightforward. In the 1980s and 1990s, Richard Gere was more than simply a movie star. He entered a generation's collective cultural memory. He attracted audiences with a whole new type of charm, without making any noise or attempting to stick out. A calm, measured voice that sounded as though each word had been carefully considered before being uttered, eyes that conveyed a history, and a posture that didn't require explanation. Richard Gere wasn't overly attractive. He was quite attractive. A guy who had survived, who was capable of love, loss, and the ability to keep his suffering to himself without speaking. His suave, charming, and damaged character Julian in American Gigolo, 1980 was a silent blow to the facade of American culture. And in the 1990 film Pretty Woman, Gere, dressed in a gray suit and with a subtle grin, won over hearts all around the world by showing a prostitute all the tenderness a wounded man could provide. He stayed away from loud action parts, superhero franchises, and formulaic big office plots. It seems that Richard Gere exclusively picked parts that have conflict, inner depth, and moral dilemmas. Primal Dread, The Fraud, Autumn in New York, and Infidelity. They had something in common. Richard Gere didn't portray the main characters, and they were never straightforward. He shared their home. Richard Gere was once required by Hollywood, not just because of his fame, but also because he represented a type of guy that is now rarely seen on screen. Mature, seasoned, and fearless in the face of stillness. Something felt slower, deeper, and more genuine when he stepped into the picture. However bright that golden light was, it was powerless against the forces outside the screen and the ebb and flow of the times. Richard Gere continued to work behind the scenes, but as he approached his 50s, his visibility on the big screen became more subdued in a field that was fixated on youth, speed, and money. He continued to perform, selecting characters that were rich, contemplative, and had profound significance while having few words. Hollywood, however, no longer desired that. With his silver hair, serious eyes, and methodical gait, Richard Gere suddenly became difficult to market in a time of superheroes, blockbuster franchises, and a worldwide audience under 30. He starred in several movies between the late 1990s and the mid-2000s and teens, although the majority were either unpopular or did not make a profit. The 1994 film Intersection received negative reviews. King David, 1985, was a disastrous endeavor that ended up being one of his worst failures. Despite having higher box office receipts, the 1997 action movie The Jackal was nonetheless written off as unmemorable. The low point was the 2009 biopic Amelia, which was criticized by reviewers and viewers alike, despite having a $40 million budget and earning less than $20 million. Even Nights in Rodanthe 2008, which attempted to restore Gere's romantic reputation with Diane Lane, was a failure. Despite earning over $40 million domestically, it was viewed as outmoded and uninteresting, and it lagged well behind other Nicholas Sparks-inspired movies like Dear John or The Notebook. Richard Gere lost his allure to younger audiences, became a hazardous celebrity, and was incompatible with the new blockbuster formula, according to studios. Gere was discreetly taken off casting lists because, in the opinion of producers struggling with the international market, particularly China, he was no longer profitable. Hollywood entered the heyday of prestige television at the same period. Richard Gere did not follow the trend of former picture office titans like Glenn Close, Kevin Spacey, and Bryan Cranston reinventing themselves in intricately designed theatrical TV shows. Maybe on purpose, maybe because he never received an invitation. He was still Richard Gere, but he was the Richard Gere of the past. He was no longer able to return to Broadway, where he had previously had a spectacular breakthrough. Despite receiving accolades for Bent and making a significant impact on stage, Gere avoided the theater for more than 30 years. No stage, no television, no blockbusters, no franchises, no Star Wars, Marvel, DC, or any other movie world. Richard Gere became an awkward anomaly in a society that was becoming increasingly homogenized. He was no longer referenced, yet no one said he had been forgotten. However, it would be incorrect to believe that Richard Gere's disappearance was due solely to his age or box office failures. Because in the end, Hollywood did not remove his name because he was no longer suitable. The reason for this was because he ventured to express something that Hollywood didn't want to hear. Hollywood never issued a formal verdict against Richard Gere. However, those who are familiar with the workings of the film industry are aware that he went too far and couldn't go back. Richard Gere took the stage to speak at the 1993 Oscars on Hollywood's most prestigious stage. Instead of reciting the standard thank yous, he publicly denounced the Chinese government, advocated for the freedom of the Tibetan people, and urged the world to pay attention to what he described as heinous human rights abuses. The whole auditorium went cold. The press broke apart. As Hollywood grew more reliant on the Chinese market, he, a well-known actor, a close friend of the Dalai Lama, and a devout Buddhist since the age of 20, effectively found himself on the unofficial blacklist of the business. Shortly after, he appeared in the 1997 movie Red Corner, which depicted the harsh Chinese justice system. In China's mainland, it was outright prohibited. The chilling effect, however, was this: Hollywood also started to silently prohibit him. Studios knew the rules, but no one uttered them aloud. In China, where the market is expanding rapidly, a movie would most likely not be allowed to be released if Richard Gere's name was on it. Had the potential to earn more at the box office than the United States. A movie being banned meant more than simply financial loss. The complex network of links and interests between the Chinese government and the film companies was at risk. Once a Chinese director who was selected for a Richard Gere production was cautioned. If he followed through, he would never be able to work again, and he and his family would never be permitted to leave the country. As if he had already accepted having a name crossed out, Gere told this narrative with an uncanny composure, and he was correct. For over 20 years the Oscars, where he had stood, spoke, and stunned the crowd, closed their doors to him. The casting calls also ceased, and the blockbuster screenplays stopped coming in. His refusal to remain silent was the cause, not his skill or age. Richard Gere was a man who didn't know how to compromise in a Hollywood that was moving more and more toward compromise. Not with producers, not with governments, not with directors, and most importantly, not with himself. There was no sacrifice made. Maybe it was just consistency to him. However, it was inconvenient for Hollywood. It was dangerous. The system was unable to process it. Even India, a country he had long held dear because of his faith and humanitarian efforts, rejected him because of a kiss that was offered at the wrong time and place. Hollywood may have abandoned him for political reasons. Richard Gere was the honored guest at an HIV/AIDS awareness event in New Delhi in March 2007 as part of a philanthropic initiative. In the midst of Shilpa Shetty's uneasy laughing and the perplexed looks of people surrounding them, Gere unexpectedly held the well-known actress firmly, kissed her repeatedly on the cheek, and performed a romantic cinematic gesture while standing next to her on stage. But in a matter of hours, the pictures were all over India's top pages. It was considered very improper for a Western guy to show admiration for a local cultural hero under daylight and media flashlights in a community that is rigid about public behavior and even considers holding hands to be over the line. The public became indignant. In a number of places, extremist organizations burned effigies of equipment as part of their demonstrations. Gere and Shetty were charged by a local resident who claimed that they were corrupting the society, violating social norms, and engaging in public indecency. In addition to accepting the complaint, the Jaipur court issued arrest warrants for Shetty and Gere. The kiss went beyond all bounds of vulgarity, according to the accusation. Gere departed India right away. Even though Shetty was obviously the passive party, she still had to show up for court. She stood up for herself. I know it's not our culture, but his. However, I didn't see anything insulting or obscene enough to warrant this response. It was insufficient. The public was unforgiving. The litigation then just persisted. No dismissal, no trial. For more than 10 years it haunted both of their names like a heavy, relentless shadow. On a charity stage, an impromptu kiss had become a muddy cultural stain, making Gere a nuisance in one of the cinema markets with the greatest rate of growth in Asia, not only in China. Only 15 years later, in 2022, did the Mumbai court formally close the case and declare Shetty innocent, citing her lack of choice in the matter. Gere never went back to India, but he was never tried either. Some might argue that it was only a communal response, a misunderstanding or a cultural error. From a different perspective, however, it made this fact clear. An artist who ventures into uncharted cultural territory, without fully understanding its invisible borders, may suffer consequences for their worldwide career in an era where everything may be exaggerated. Richard Gere was not destroyed by that kiss. However, it further damaged the reputation of a guy who, for very different reasons, was hard for Asia and Hollywood to accept. Richard Gere did not back down after all this, but he also did not follow. No complaints, no explanations, he just moved aside and followed his own course. He shifted to indie films after being rejected by big studios, where no one could use market preferences or spreadsheets to dictate his creative aspirations. The Benefactor 2015, The Dinner 2017 and Arbitrage 2012 are all slow, quiet, private films that are not intended for a large audience. However, he gave some of his finest performances ever in them. He had never behaved better than in Norman, according to a New York Times article. According to Deadline, Richard Gere's performance in The Dinner was a part of an amazing independent cinema comeback. However, there were no significant red carpets, box office rankings, or Oscar nominations, only him and his personas. Richard Gere was aware of that and decided it was worth the cost. While Hollywood rushes towards streaming, sequels, reboots, and superheroes, Richard Gere chooses to remain outside the machine, he stated bluntly in an interview with The Hollywood Reporter. He doesn't belong to it, not because he is resentful. He doesn't make appearances on late-night talk programs, act in viral movies, or set up social media profiles to keep followers interested. Since he has never thought that presence equals existence, he doesn't need to be everywhere. Gere decides to live like the characters he has portrayed in his 70s, self-reflective, devoted, and resilient enough to endure forgetting as long as he adheres to his moral convictions. Hollywood is not necessary for him to be recognized. It's also possible that Hollywood is relieved to be free of someone like him, someone who, by living authentically, upends the system's polished veneer. Few people in Hollywood lead such a life as Richard Gere, fewer still who dare. Unlike many celebrities, Richard Gere pursued Tibetan Buddhism as a spiritual path since his 20s rather than as a fad. He didn't learn to talk, to listen, he studied. And he discovered something that Hollywood would never be able to teach him during those months in Dharamsala, the northern Indian mountain town where the Dalai Lama lives in exile: silence. Richard Gere was among the first Americans to establish a strong friendship with the Dalai Lama shortly afterward. Not a public relations partnership, but a sincere bond based on commitment, faith, and communication. In order to assist human rights work, medical aid, indigenous preservation, HIV/AIDS awareness, and anti-discrimination initiatives, he co-founded the non-profit Tibet House and later the Gere Foundation. He attended the 2007 HIV awareness event in India for the same reason, where he became a target after just one kiss. However, anyone who believed that controversy would make him abandon his purpose was unaware of Richard Gere. He continued. He never used his faith as a branding strategy for media efforts, and he never expressed regret for his beliefs. Many individuals display their ideas on the walls of Hollywood, merely to discuss them throughout the holidays. Gere, however, lives his life every day. He does not practice Buddhism. It's his breathing, his actions, and his perspective on the world. He was in front of the U.S. He did not recoil when asked to appear before Congress on human rights in China. He refused to remain silent when big studios offered him international projects in exchange. He decided to stay in meditation rather than go back to what he had previously transcended when his celebrity waned. He was not compelled to live this way, but since he was unable to live any other way, Richard Gere spent his whole life choosing a difficult route. With his silver hair, meditative stare, and unwavering faith, Richard Gere became inconvenient in a film industry that was becoming more and more homogenized due to global preferences. He didn't capitulate to be remembered or bend to be pardoned. When others remained mute, he spoke up. He took a step back because he no longer wanted to fight for something he no longer believed in, not because he had lost. And in some way we are forced to listen because of his quiet. That raises a question. How many individuals still have the guts to stick to their convictions when no one else is around to support them in a society that is always warning us to exercise caution and to keep quiet in order to survive? Pity is not something Richard Gere solicits, but maybe the dilemma no one dares to pose out loud, between living morally and just getting by, is what makes us pause when we see him. Which would you pick? Have you ever thought highly of Richard Gere? Post your comments below. What in your opinion caused him to be expelled? Would you dare to do the same if you were in his shoes? Remember to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any more stirring tales about the heroes you previously adored.